we're going to be multiplying and dividing decimals. Now, multiplying and dividing decimals is a little bit more tricky, so make sure that you're paying close attention and that you're taking notes in your academic journal. There are lots of rules for both multiplying and dividing decimals. First, we're going to take a look at multiplication rules. The first rule we need to remember is that we need to treat the decimal as if it was a whole number. This way, we can basically multiply like regular without worrying about the decimal for the most part. Do not line up by place value. So this is kind of opposite of when we added and subtracted in the last week. So this time, we're just going to line it up just as if we were doing regular multiplication. Now we're going to multiply as usual, and you'll see an example on the next slide of what this means. Finally, when you're done with your answer, you're going to go back to the factors and you're going to count the number of decimal places that were in your factors in the original problem. Then, the same amount of factors that you had in your original problem, you're going to add in your answer. So for example, if you had 3 decimal places in your factors, then your answer needs to have 3 decimal places. Now let's take a look at division. Division is a little bit different. There's a couple different rules to remember. The first rule that we need to remember is that when we're dividing, the divisor goes outside the house. The dividend goes inside the house. Remember what the house is when we talked about it in the first unit. The house is the long division sign when we're dividing whole numbers and decimals. The next thing we need to remind ourselves is that if the divisor is a decimal, we need to make it a whole number. We cannot divide decimals when the outside is a decimal. Therefore, we have to create a whole number by moving the decimal point all the way to the right. We also learned this in Unit 2 when we were making decimals and moving the decimal point to change its value. If we change the decimal place of the divisor, we must change the decimal place of the dividend. Therefore, if you moved the decimal point 1 time in the divisor, we're going to move the point 1 time in the dividend. To kind of get what's going on here, we want to make sure we repeat the same thing. Everything needs to stay the same. Finally, you need to move that decimal point on top of the house. Now, if you moved it all the way to the right, then the decimal point would kind of not exist anymore because now it's both whole numbers. But let's look at an example on the next couple slides where the decimal is still inside the house. Multiplying decimals. So let's take a look at multiplying decimals. Here's a problem, 35.2 times 2.3. Now, as you remember, the first step was to ignore the decimal and treat this as if it was a whole number. Remember, do not line up the place values. So if you see in my problem, I did not line up the place values. I just made sure that it's lined up all the way to the right like a normal multiplication problem. Now we solve. We're solving just like regular, where you multiply all the ones place, then you multiply the tens place. Don't forget to add your 0 when you're moving down to your tens place. Once I have my answer, I want to remember that I have to count the number of decimal places in my factors. Now, my original factors had 2 decimal places. Therefore, I need to have 2 decimal places in my answer. As you see below, I made 2 decimal places where now my answer is 80.96. Now, let's take a look at dividing decimals. Now, dividing decimals is a little more tricky, but we need to follow the same steps that we just learned in the slides before. The problem is 3.96 divided by 0.9. Now, we need to make sure we put the decimal places exactly where they need to go. So here's our house. Now, we move the decimal place 1 time in the beginning because our divisor needs to become a whole number. Now, because we moved the divisor 1 time, we need to move the dividend 1 time. Therefore, the decimal place was moved behind the 9. Now, because it's still inside, the decimal needs to move up on top of the house. After I have set up my problem, I can solve as normal. I'm going to solve my problem using my normal long division steps. Once I'm finished, I need to make sure that I cross out my last number, make sure there's nothing else I have to go, and I'm done. 4.4 is my final answer. Thanks for watching. Make sure if you have any questions that you revisit this PowerPoint or look at the instructional videos that I've included at the bottom through Edpuzzle.